Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to have you attend this morning. This is the first of our spring series of Plato. I think it must be the 11th year we've been doing this. And I should remind some of you who have been with me all that time that we did talk about the grid 3.5 years ago in the fall of 2017. And I don't know if you can see me this morning. I think not, unless let me see if I can hold up my.
Yeah, we see you on the side.
Can you? Yeah, okay, I think you can see me now. I'm gonna hold up a book that we looked at 3.5 years ago. You can't see it very well, but it's called Living on the Grid. And it's by William Thompson, who is with the Dominion Virginia Power for 38 years. And I chose to repeat a couple of his slides, particularly his wife, Betty, who's a nice cartoonist. And just to remind you that we have touched on that, but that was a physical part of the grid that we looked at before. This other book we did talk about a little bit, and this is called The Grid, The Fraying Wires Between Americans and Our Energy Future by Gretchen, is that pronounced Baki, Meredith?
I don't know. I've always said Baki.
Yeah, I think it's Baki. And she's an anthropologist, and she did a wonderful job, but it's quite complicated. What I like about Meredith's book, and I will introduce you in a second, Meredith, is this is the book that we're going to be talking about today. It's called Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of the Electric Grid by Meredith Angwin. And this is more conversational. It's a little longer, but I think it's easier to digest. And but it's so that's what we're going to be talking today. And I think it's a great evolution in Plato that we're now coming back to the grid, and it was such an opportune time. So Meredith, if you'd just like to say hi to the group and let us know a thing or two about your background. I think that you're a physical chemist, is that right? And you've been working in the industry for quite a long time.
Yes, I'm a physical chemist, and I've been working in the industry. As a physical chemist, I worked on pollution control and corrosion control and various types of generators, for example, nuclear, geothermal, natural gas, coal, and so forth. And I was one of the first women project managers at Electric Power Research Institute. Sometimes people want to say that I was the first, but no, I think there were 3 of us among about 200 men at the time that I became a project manager. I was not the first. Anyway, so I've been working on electricity issues for a long time, mostly from the standpoint of being a chemist and being a materials person. When I was semi-retired and came out to Vermont, I started a blog in favor of keeping our local nuclear plant going, and Vermont Yankee. And somebody I didn't know read the blog. That's the thing; the blogs are out there. Someone reads it, and he says, I noticed that when there's a FERC ruling or something that affects Vermont Yankee, you write about it. Have you ever thought of joining the Consumer Liaison Group Coordinating Committee? And I said, can you say those words again? Well, anyway, the long and short of it is I did run for election in our Grid Operators Consumer Liaison Group Coordinating Committee. And that is when I actually began to learn about the grid. And after a while, I began thinking, when people would ask me a question, I would end up with a long-winded explanation. I thought, this has to be a book. I mean, I can't just keep trying to say, well, let me explain about the capacity markets and what they're doing with them now. Anyway, so that's it. And that's that's how the book got going. I think that the grid has become very, very fragile in the areas that are regional transmission run by regional transmission organizations. And it is, you can look at where the regional transmission organizations are, but one thing you can think is if people are saying, this is there are high prices on the auctions, or renewables are the cheapest things in the auctions, or anytime they use that word auction, then you are talking about a regional transmission organization area in general. That's it. Back to you.
Good. Well, thank you for that. I should also mention, as a little bit of an apology, I've been told by some of my faculty colleagues that one should not read long slides, that one should have a photograph or a diagram and have bullet points. And as you can see over on the left in this slide, I've done that. But as you get into a book of this character with this lovely conversational phrases, I find it hard, since I didn't write the book, to put it into bullets. And so I'm going to ask your forgiveness, particularly of those in the faculty audience, that I'm going to be reading a fair amount of the slides, but I think that this way we retain some of Meredith's way of writing, and I think it's more attractive that way. If you'll bear with me, there will be a bit of reading. So on this first slide, we have just a table of contents from her book. We start off with some easy problems, how things work under ideal conditions, and then start dealing with markets and fuel security, get into renewables and how they work in the grid, because that's a big issue today. And then the relationship between the customer and the regional
Transmission organization.
Yes, and finally, is there a way forward? So we will work our way along, and there are about 40 plus slides, so we should get going, so we have a little bit of time for each one. This first slide here is taken from Gretchen's book. I like the definition. A complex just-in-time system, our grid is, for taking and almost simultaneously delivering a standardized electric current. Notice the word standardized, wherever it's needed at once. This is in 3.5 lines, a lot of information, and it tells us a lot about the grid. People think of it as a giant storage device, and it's not anything but, as we've now learned from our issues in Texas. It is also a giant loop that starts and ends at the power plant or generating station. This is one of the things that Meredith emphasizes. The power grid is about keeping the lights on, the generators and wires, and that's what we've been thinking about up until now. But then there's also a policy grid, and that's about payments and policies, the latter often determined by RTOs, or regional transmission organizations, or ISOs, independent system operators. I put up here on the right some 4 qualities in order of importance to Meredith. It must be reliable, as inexpensive as feasible, non-polluting, and non-disruptive. The non-disruptive relates a little bit to, or to a fair degree, to intermittent dispensed sources of energy, such as rooftop solar panels and that sort of thing, which can be more disruptive than a large power plant. We'll go into that later. But the most important thing in Meredith's eyes, and I think in most eyes, is the reliability. So this is the other book that I mentioned that we reviewed 3.5 years ago, and I just pay some respect to his wife Betty, who did these sketches that I'll flip through quickly. Pretty fundamental. Here's a coal plant over here, a nuclear plant here, and 2 houses is the load. And what I think is sort of funny about it is that to start off, it only has 10 kilowatts, which is a ridiculously tiny amount of energy and a tiny load. A couple of little birds here sitting on the wires, but it starts off with that simplicity. Well, it can get a little more complicated, obviously. Here are 3 plants, all nuclear plants here, making different voltages. And these voltages are stepped up with a transformer for transmission across distances, but they're different voltages still if they're simply increased by a given amount. And to communicate back and forth, they need to link up and then go to the respective substations and loads. To further complicate the physical grid, you have substations where the energy is changed from high voltage low amperage to lower voltage, various amperages to be distributed to the loads. So I think that gives us a very quick summary of Betty's sketches. We have some idea of how the grid is functioning. A couple of other definitions from, or not definitions, but comments from Gretchen. I think it was Gretchen who made these points. We must avoid damaging the equipment, losing power to customers, or unbalancing other grids. And we accomplish this by anticipating demand. This is a very important thing. You have to predict how much current you're going to have and have it ready when you need it, and have lots of reserve power, or obtain it rapidly from another grid. That's so key and comes up so often in understanding the grid. The utility can also drop services to customers if they see problems coming. And for example, in the Texas situation, some people have said, and there's probably some truth to this, that if they hadn't done some work in dropping service to customers in the so-called rolling blackouts or brownouts, they might have lost the grid entirely, and it could have gone down for a month or so. And so there wasn't too much equipment damaged, except mostly by the storm. And that way they were able to recover in a few days, fortunately. The grid is constantly challenged by factors that can cause major problems, and we've seen that certainly, and big events can lead to a blackout. I remember about 10 years ago, going to a wedding in Detroit, and somebody had thrown a long bad switch in, the wedding was in central Michigan, and somebody, I think, either in Detroit or Ohio, had thrown a bad switch. And the northeastern part of the states went down for about 48 hours, I think, and all the flowers for the wedding and all the cakes and desserts and so on had to be thrown out. So that was a big problem as we saw it from our point of view crossing the country. Recovery is difficult since generation and load must be matched constantly. So here we're coming now to Meredith's book and some of the points she's making. This is a small map, but it shows where we are here in Madison in the mid-continent ISO, or called MISO, and over in New England, Meredith is at the ISO NE for New England. I got a kick out of this little one. PJM, I thought it was a short form for pajamas, but it stands for Pennsylvania, Jersey, and Maryland. So they call it PJM. And here is our famous reliability grid down here. Her points are that North America has been largely divided into RTO areas, and she's concerned about its closed door governance through participant committees, and that it needs to be more transparent. She shows what happens on the grid and what to watch out for as you advocate for change. The grid's fragility will have economic and health consequences, and we saw some of that this past week in Texas, so we should all try to protect it. Before RTOs, utilities were vertically integrated, and this is an interesting term, vertically integrated, but it means that the companies own both the plants and the lines. And that was in the past one company, but gradually since 1973 and much more I think in the 80s and 90s, RTOs have developed, and she feels that these are more fragile. There's little responsibility for grid reliability. And she says that they tend to, behind closed doors, reward their favorites. And she questions, is this really a true market? So here is another larger view of North America. And you can see even Canada gets into the action here. They have, we'll touch upon Ontario here later on, because they have hydro from Niagara Falls. I grew up in London, and so we used to just call it hydro, and then it became Ontario Hydro, and now it's called the Ontario Regional Grid or something like that. We'll find that out later when we get there. I've forgotten now the term, but they had to change their name because it's involves a lot of nuclear energy, actually more of that than from Niagara Falls. And then we have this ERCOT down here, Electric Reliability Council of Texas. And in this area over to the left here, California ISO, it's really broken up into a bunch of balancing authorities. And it's not certain the future of this, whether the ISOs will take over the balancing authorities. There are quite a number of them here, too many to read, but it shows that there's still an evolution in divvying up the controls across North America of electricity generation and the marketing of it. This comes to one of her first chapter titled The Angelic Miracle of the Grid. And you see here the time goes from midnight until 9 o'clock in the evening. And then the ordinate here is thousands of megawatts. And so, and that's the ordinate here. So more electricity was used at 9 o'clock than at 2:45 in the afternoon. And you can imagine why that would be. There would be people turning on things at home for breakfast, and those who were earlier workers getting in a little bit earlier and turning things on at work. And so there's a combined increase in what this was the forecast, I think, up here, and they actually delivered this amount. So things matched fairly well, and there was not too much difficulty with the grid. And that was the point of that slide. But out in California, it's not like New England, and you have a sunny environment with a lot of rooftops that have been having solar panels on them. And so they call this duck curve because it has the shape of a duck. And particularly, it looks like the shape of the duck with a full-breasted belly here in the center, as solar over the years from 2012 to 2020 has gradually developed more energy and reduced the net load on the grid, again going from 12 midnight until 12 midnight. And during the day, as the sun comes up here at 9 or 10 o'clock, more and more energy is developed on rooftops and therefore less load on the grid. And so this distributed form of energy acts like a somewhat interfering challenge for grid operators, because they have to ramp up very quickly as the sun is going down and people are turning on their stoves and televisions and computers. You have to have, oftentimes in California, methane powered plants in the spinning mode so that they can immediately turn on and cope with this, anticipate this increase in need for energy. Then we have this balancing authority, and there are some rules on the grid. I wasn't aware of these rules before.
Well,
but
they're not official rules. They're just guidelines. I mean,
right. Yeah, I should thank you for making that true. That's true. So no plant should provide more than 10% of the average demand for power, and one plant going offline mustn't take 20% of the grid's power with it. But this is certainly going to make the work for the balancing authority a lot more easily. So in the previous slide, the duck curve, solar looks distributed, but in California, it can act like a single mega plant, which switches off just as the lights come on, and that's the problem. I thought Meredith had a nice story here. Apparently, when she was dealing with this area of volt ampere reactives, or VARs, something that we'll touch on from time to time, she was told that you could, and correct me if I'm wrong in requoting you, Meredith, but she said you can think of it as riding a bicycle. You have to, if you have a stationary bike in your basement or study and you're just pedaling along, that's all you have to do is put all that energy into turning the wheels. But when you're on a real bicycle, you also have extra energy, because as you turn the wheels to keep your balance, you're going to have to add a little bit more energy to keep that balance and keep the speed up so that you don't fall to one side or the other. And it's like this in terms of the volt ampere, which are multiplied together to give us watts, that you have these reactives, and that they have to be kept in balance at all times. Anything you would like to add to that, Meredith?
well, yeah, I got a lot of people commenting on it. By the analogy I used was from a professor at let's see, Rochester Institute of Technology, I believe, and it was a good analogy. And then a bunch of people said, well, you're not talking about inertia. You should talk about inertia too. And I'm like, oh yeah, right. But what I'm trying to say is that the volts and the amperes that we see on the grid are not the only thing that's going on. There's also this reactive business, which is described as keeping in balance. It's an excellent way to describe it. But it's also, if you wanted to get all geeky about it, you could describe it as the imaginary number part of the sine curve or something like that. But we don't want to go there.
Right.
And similarly, so, but what I wanted to say is that, if you want to look at a grid, you can't just look at how many kilowatts or megawatts are put on it. You have to look at some of these other issues. For example, if you have a wind turbine or a solar facility, it will be using inverters rather than rotating electric machinery to put energy on the grid, and that has to be accounted for. It's not an impossible thing to account for, but it just has to be accounted for, and people don't realize how many things have to be taken care of for that angelic miracle of that when I turn on a light, somewhere a power plant makes a little more energy, a little more electricity to supply that light, because it's always in balance.
Good point. Thank you. Okay, and this is a map that I picked up somewhere along the way showing some of these balancing authorities and the names of some of these RTOs. And another statistic I read recently is that 30,000 miles of wires are crisscrossing the country to help maintain this balance. These double triangles are connections from alternating current to direct current. Direct current can sometimes be used for high intensity delivery of energy across country, and that has to be switched back to alternating current. You notice that there's a center here in Montreal where a huge amount of hydroelectric power comes from the state of the province of Quebec. And there's another one here in Ontario where a lot of nuclear power is generated. So, but they're all over the place. And this seems to be a major center here. Is that Denver, Colorado?
I don't know where that is. I'm sorry. That's the Southwest Power Pool, but I don't know where they're located.
Yeah,
New England is located in Massachusetts.
Yeah, it looks a little southeast of Denver, but in any case, it's a center. Okay, well, their duties is to ensure the grid supply matches the power requirement. Of course, that's key, and that the right technology is there. Steam plants cannot ramp up and down as quickly as gas turbines do, and we'll touch on that later. We also have this term ancillary services, and that is special payment for some plants that spin on standby. I mentioned that idea of the duck curves and how we have to have gas plants spinning just ready to pick up right away. And thus people who swear that renewables can do everything assume that the storage problem can be solved. Well, you can see just here in this little example of California that we don't have the batteries yet to do this. And sometimes people assume that renewables can do more than they really can. They need help considerably. Batteries and underground thermal storage have progressed a little, but storage cannot be scaled up to support a regional grid. And for 20 years, the past 20 years, we've been turning left instead of right. Let me explain this table. It's one of my favorite tables, and I just discovered it a few months ago. Let me come back here. Wade Allison, a professor of physics at Oxford University, came up with this table, and I have some issues with the title here. I think it should be burning organics rather than just chemical electronic. To burn organics, that's what we've been doing for 150, 200 years, using fossil fuels. More recently, we can even use some food and biofuels for this. And it's based upon most of it, particularly the fossil fuels, on the sunshine in geological epochs developing, leaving us with this marvelous fossil fuel, coal, oil, natural gas, and so on. Coming down to the third line, this is a key line. I don't know how they came up with this number, but I haven't studied Wade Allison's math, but he had oops, sorry about that. Problem with using he had it's in kilowatt hours per kilogram of fuel. And this is an even harder one. to calculate how he must have done this. He took the, presumably the materials that went into making wind turbines and solar panels and the amount of energy from them per kilogram of material. And because otherwise we don't have a real sense of fuel for renewables. And this is, of course, based upon daily seasonal sunshine and wind. And but we've basically lost 4 logarithms as we've turned to the left column. So fuel for a whole lifetime of one individual would be 10 million tons as opposed to 1,000 tons. This is a significant drop. Whereas if we had gone to the right, we would have gone up about 7 or 6 logs here. So you would only have needed 1 kilogram, enough to put in a Coke can to provide, that's uranium, to provide enough energy for 1 person for a lifetime. And this energy, of course, came from pre-solar stellar collapse supernovae, and it left this planet with uranium and thorium, which not only provide this wonderful fuel, but give us a molten core that helps to protect, gives us magnetic fields, and it protects us from solar winds. But to the point, it's reliable, safe, and compact, resilient, available 24/7, but it has failed, or is failing because of our failed education and the public apprehension that comes as a result. So my little plug for nuclear energy, but I think it is often overlooked. The energy density differences going 4 logs in the wrong direction instead of 7 logs in the right direction, it makes us really try and supply the grid with one hand tied behind our back, I think. If you ensure the grid supply matches power requirement, it's key. We've talked about that. So let's move on to this slide. There was a long history of overbuilding power plants before RTOs, and so lack of power wasn't a problem in the early years. But the distribution system caused more power outages, but still Meredith credits most utilities for having done a good job. But in the RTO areas, distribution utilities buy their power at auctions that are run by the RTO. Power plants therefore compete against each other at 5-minute intervals. I was not aware of this at all, totally new to me. And this removed each power plant's incentives for reliability, having these auctions all the time. For most of New England, being safely warm in the winter depends on having a reliable grid, especially for cities like Boston. And living in this area, Meredith is very aware of how dependent it is on gas-fired power plants, which make over 50% of their electricity. And you have a certain limitation in the delivery of heat to homes as well as electric utilities. In early January of 3 years ago, the gas lines were not big enough to heat homes and feed the power plants. And so 1/3 of their electricity had to come from, they brought in oil. And so what went wrong with utility deregulation? Well, there are no consumer choices. Without choice, prices generally don't fall as they do. Well, that's a fairly broad.
I wanted to say that some areas have some consumer choice, but
Yes.
if you're going to say what is the one thing that an RTO has that other people don't have, I'd say other areas don't have, I'd say, well, auctions where electricity is bought by distribution utilities. That's the most typical thing. That's the important thing. Consumer choice, some of them have a little, some of them have a little more, some of them have none.
Good, thank you for that. I appreciate that clarification. No transparency. Insiders meet secretly to use their power influence with which power plants are on grid and get paid, and no accountability. Generation utilities own their power plants, so they don't assume responsibility for maintaining a reliable grid. So these are some of the issues. And she documents this with a 20-year history here of the costs that are highlighted in yellow from restructured states that have RTOs versus the older non-restructured states. And you can see over a period of time, they've maintained a price differential and more expensive those that have RTOs. And then she has a chapter called Gaming the System, where distribution utilities buy from generation utilities, which are not true utilities. they're really power plant owners, which sell through wholesale markets to their distribution utilities. And no individual owner is responsible for keeping the grid going. This is a problem. The California legislature put a cap on utility prices to the customer. The system was set up to be gamed thereby so that large utilities with plants in California could close certain regions for maintenance to create a scarcity and drive up electricity prices. Other plants got the money and California got the rolling blackout. So that can be a problem. At RTO auctions, power plants are paid per kilowatt hour produced, either in real time or a day ahead. Plants make power purchase agreements or PPAs with a distribution utility. Due to uncertainty over the maintenance and reliability of a given plant, RTO has added another aspect to the market, this available capacity. This is a key factor, and you'll see this coming up in a slide very soon. Such payments encourage power plants to be available, and that's nice, but it gives some sources of energy, particularly methane or natural gas, a definite advantage. Subsequent bidding turned into a high stakes monopoly game. And you can see it here. I took some shading in Meredith's book. This is done with cross-hatching, but I just had to make it clear that the energy is here in yellow. And this capacity is in blue. And you can see that the natural gas plants here, natural gas with combined cycle. Here it's coal with steam turbine. Here it's natural gas and oil with steam turbine. And here it's natural gas oil with gas turbine. And then at
I'd like to talk about that one for a minute if you
yes, let me come to that. There we are. But just let me mention that, please do, but look at all this energy. For nuclear, wind only has to make half as much energy because of this green, which is the tax credits, both production tax credits and renewable energy credits. And the gas plants have a tremendous revenue from their capacity. There's also some ancillary services here. So there's a remarkable advantage that gas has over nuclear. Go ahead, Meredith.
Well, I was just going to say that if you look at it this way, the yellow parts here, energy, this is what the plant gets paid for putting kilowatt hours on the grid. And since what we all want is a kilowatt hour at our home, you would think that would be the majority of a plant's payments. But that's only true for a plant like nuclear that puts out a lot of kilowatt hours. As soon as you begin going over to, for example, natural gas, oil, gas turbines. Let's look at the one right over to the next to wind, okay, for a minute.
Sure.
You see all that blue, that is the percentage of the plant's payments that come from capacity payments. So so capacity payments give these plants an advantage. Now, one thing that means is that the natural gas can bid very low on the kilowatt hour market because that's not where it's getting its money anyway necessarily. So it's a very complicated system, but it does show that for example, wind gets so much of its money from the production tax credits and so forth, and simple gas turbines, the one get a lot of their money from capacity payments. Now, if you look at the red part, ancillary services, that's mainly because the simple gas turbines are also the ones that are paid to keep spinning to back up the renewables when, for example, at the fast ramp up part of the duck curve.
Yes.
Okay.
Good, thank you. I appreciate that. It's a wonderful figure, and I think it gives huge insight to things that none of us knew about before. So this just relates a little bit to what we just saw, the three strategies to undercut nuclear. Nuclear plants live by their energy prices, gas plants from their capacity payments, renewable plants live and die from their RECs and PTCs. So the gas-fired plants at the moment are winning since capacity prices are up and energy prices are down. Most people, how come most people don't understand the grid? In a vertically integrated utility area, an ordinary person can go to a state public utility committee hearing and figure out what's going on. But in RTO areas, they often discourage public participation and have complex voting rules. Digging deeper, we find the ability of a plant to come online with just-in-time delivery is important, and this favors gas over nuclear. But I was on a podcast, actually it was a Zoom meeting with Rod Adams, who's quite a famous nuclear advocate, and we discussed this business of ramping up and down quickly. And he said he ran a nuclear sub in our Navy years ago, and he said, reality, it's not that hard to vary the power in a steam turbine if you have to in a submarine. So I thought that was kind of funny, and I had to insert it here. I think with the new reactors that are being developed, it would be much easier to ramp up quickly and do at least a certain degree of energy following with nuclear than it is at the moment. This is not from Meredith's book, but I thought it's a fascinating slide. The data is from Edison Electric International, and you need to take a little bit of time to look at it. First of all, this turquoise shading is of all things for coal. You wouldn't think they give it such a pretty color. Usually they make them black. Natural gas is an appropriate mustardy brown. Nuclear is an appropriate green. And then they have these other sources of energy. Hydro is black, biomass kind of orangey, wind a nice sky blue, solar red, that's pretty appropriate, geothermal orange, I suppose so. But in Edison International, it's 34% other. Now, what on earth is the other? I racked my brains and I don't think it's wave energy or anything like that. So I guess that it must be importing energy from adjacent regions into their company. Do you have any thoughts about that, Meredith?
No, I really haven't studied this, but I do know that, for example, ISO New England puts out a pie chart of where all its energy is coming from, and that only shows energy that is generated in New England. I have a friend, Warren Van Wyck, who's made his own website on it, and he goes over to another part of ISO New England where it tells how much is being imported, and he puts that into the pie chart too, and then it becomes a somewhat different pie chart with about 16% imports or so all the time. So I mean, but yeah, I don't know where that 34% is, but I suspect it is imports, probably from Canada a lot of the time.
I would think so too. I went on their website and I couldn't find any trace of it. But I should point out that they're, of course, advertising a little bit that they've got the lowest emission rate of any of these large electric companies. And it goes up a factor of over twofold through these different companies that you see listed here. The size of the company in terms of their total electricity generated is over here. But I think it's interesting to see that those companies that have used more natural gas and less coal do a little bit better for obvious reasons than these ones down here who like American Electric Power use a lot of coal, and they have a relatively less gas and nuclear, and so they have a high emissions rate. But these are some of the bigger utilities, and I think while it's interesting to look at the RTOs and the ISOs, it's also interesting to note these companies and how they vary in the kinds of plants that they purchase or include in their programs. Moving on then from this one, when renewable advocates say we don't need baseload, they mean we don't need to design some plants for baseload and some for load following. They just dream that renewables will do it all, like sports cars will do it all for transportation, and forgetting that we need some trucks too. So I like this phrase that Meredith used, beware of the word could. What actually happens isn't could. Wind does not make baseload power, nor does it make load following power. Most of the time, the grid has to work around renewables. And this is from her book, and it's a little tough to read, but I blew it up as much as I could. And let me explain it to you. It's within the ISO in New England, and it's an example of working around renewables. What I find disappointing is the amount of natural gas, and although nuclear isn't bad, it's only 4% hydro and 6% renewable. They should have included the hydro with the renewables, but some people don't like to do that. In any case, let's just take the 6% for argument and move down here. Here's the renewable thing, and this is what horrified me. 32% of the renewable electricity comes from burning refuse, I guess, and burning wood. This wood sometimes comes from Canada or Brazil as pellets, and they certainly do that in Germany and parts of Europe. I don't know where they bring their wood from. In New England, they probably don't need to import it, but it's still very foul air as a result. It's awful emissions, not quite as bad as coal, but almost. And there's a bit of wind here. Let me see, where the 18% wind and some solar, which isn't bad, but it's and a bit of landfill gas. But I'm just amazed that we call refuse wood renewable. It got that way, and everybody thinks renewables are sweet, but it sure does dirty up the air. So I have some issues with the whole word renewable. But anyway, the good point about biofuels is it can be burned at any time, and so it can fill in to some degree for wind and solar when the sun goes down. Nobody sees all that smoke going into the air. So the hardcore renewable advocates, and I even give the page numbers here in case you get this book from the library or buy your own copy. Around page 100 and around page 200, it's really hot stuff, and I enjoyed her way of dealing with Jacobson and Clack. Probably many of you have already heard me decry this competition where Jacobson was suing Clack for publishing some accurate data, and it was headed for litigation, but fortunately it was settled out of court, and in the lawsuit it still had a chilling effect on renewable energy debate. I like this also. She recommended two excellent articles, both of them I think free. The Road Right to Nowhere by Mike Conley and Tim Maloney, and you can find them on the Google those. The Non-Solutions Project is a book written by this fellow. I think he's from Finland.
No, he's from the Netherlands. He's from
the Netherlands. Okay, thank you. I beg your pardon. Yep. He's an excellent book. I have it. I should have remembered. Sadly, one version of the Green New Deal excluded nuclear, large-scale hydro, and waste-to-energy technologies, among others. But I think that has been modified quite a bit. It's the Green New Deal is taking some flack because it has gone through many different versions, and it's hard to say which one a person's talking about. But ultimately, hopefully, it will include nuclear. And I think that Biden is using the words more and more clean energy rather than renewable. And Meredith, although she has long supported the whole concept of renewables, she does have some issues. There are about 10 of them, but I just focused on the big three here. She has some issues with daily spikiness, and you can see that in any of the curves that are available today online. It shows the wind in particular, very, very spiky. Clouds pass across the sun, and the winds are quite variable, and they need backup, and that most often comes from burning methane. Also, a lack of reliability, although that didn't cause the Texas problem. That was a general problem, but still there can be some without battery storage or hydro plant expansion. This just isn't a reality. The effects of electricity quality and costs, since they get outside funding, they can bid low and drive down prices. So nuclear plants sometimes must pay to put their power on the grid, and that might be partly why they're talking about shutting down 3 nuclear plants in Illinois, which I think would be a tragedy, and I hope they can change that. And I think that Biden might help us to do that. So her summary on renewables and batteries, she says, I think these are such good words. The problem is not with renewables or with batteries. The problem is that people are not planning for their use or how they might be most useful. Renewables and batteries are overhyped and are beginning to be overbuilt. Both can be helpful to the grid, but even together, they cannot be the grid. Nuclear plants do not emit combustion products into the air. They make most 50%, 5% of our zero emission electricity. notice this new term now instead of renewables, zero emission electricity. And that's such a catch-all that they've thought up this term, zero emission credit. And that's discussed on page 254. And that's about a quarter of the cost of renewable energy credits, but it's a step in the right direction. And she pays appropriate respect for the grid as the largest machine on Earth. It's the preeminent engineering achievement of the 20th century. All the components have to work together as outlined in the integrated resource plans. And now the RTO is saddled with fixing the extra costs of renewables. Meredith likes them, but that is renewables. And she tried to explain their role, but she's against greenwashing, RTO oversight, marketing e-sources as being equivalent. I especially liked this chapter that she wrote called Personal Responsibility. And it relates to the responsibility of the citizens of Germany who really got behind this Energiewende idea that they had, that they would just become a great renewable energy country. And they put, these people dedicatedly put solar panels on most of the roofs. It's just incredible to see Germany from the air and to fly over the homes all covered with solar panels. They use about the same amount of electricity as the people in France, if you consider it's 6,500 kilowatt hours per capita. And on this map, and I highly encourage you to go on this, it's a wonderful thing. I went on it 3 weeks ago and I was just fascinated to see these shadings. Of course, the shadings relate to how clean the energy is. And France is a leader. So is Sweden up here. Poland is the worst, of course, the darkest. And England is not doing all that well. We'll get back to England in a few moments. But look at these little arrows showing that France is exporting clean energy. Belgium, not quite so clean. And the Netherlands, I think, a little less clean. But she points out, even if every person in Germany, and they certainly do, I think, tried to lower their electricity use, use LED lights and so on, they're still building coal plants over here as they're taking down nuclear plants. And it will ultimately miss its climate goals unless there's a change in their policy.
I feel very strongly that you have to make civic decisions as well as personal decisions.
Yeah.
And sometimes people saying, oh, well, you know, what you have to do is, you know, stop using your dryer or something, you know, then it's a way of spreading guilt around, but it really doesn't spread clean air around. You have to make civic decisions as well as personal decisions.
Very, very well put. I remember when I had solar panels installed on my roof 13 years ago, I went to this Focus on Energy group here in Madison, and they came around, spent an entire day researching my house and its electrical needs and so on. And they made some strong recommendations before they installed or recommended a solar installer. And one of them was to change my dryer from electric to gas fired. And back then, I suppose it made a bit of sense because the gas would take electricity as an inefficient way of drying clothes. And they felt that gas was better. But still, now, 13 years later, I'm not so sure that was such a good move because methane is not a good greenhouse gas. And hopefully not much of it is leaking from around my house. But still, there are leaks generated from all the fracking. And the only thing I think that solar panels did for me is make me aware of energy use, make me value electricity more because I know how long it takes to generate 10 kilowatt hours. It takes a whole day and in the summertime, and I don't generate any in the winter. So I just appreciate it more when you realize how hard it is to make it. I like this one too from this is David. Well, this is the website that Meredith gave us for England. I chose England here, and I think it's a fascinating thing. It shows nuclear. They have a bit of nuclear, and they're using over half of their capacity on this given day 3 weeks ago, a little bit of biomass, quite a bit of wind, about a little less than half their capacity. And that's probably just because they can't change that any. But then you come down to this natural gas bar. They have to do that because they're just not making enough with wind and nuclear. And so they just have to do it. But also they're importing electricity from Belgium, from France, from Scotland, from the Orkney Islands, from Ireland and the Netherlands. So bringing in a little bit as well to help them out. But I thought that was wonderful. And also this guy, David McKay, he's a great guy, now passed away. But he wrote a wonderful book called Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. You can find it probably in your local library. It's a great book.
Let me comment also that you can download it as a PDF for free from the web. And if you don't want to download such a long thing, you can look at what chapters you want and download them separately.
Very good point. Thank you for that. You're quite right. And what he said in one phrase was, if the English captured every water drop that fell on their highlands and made it run through a hydro plant, they could harvest 1,500 kilowatt hours per person per day. Oh, that was priceless. It's like leaving a 60-watt light bulb on 24 hours. I have all kinds of neighbors who leave 100-watt light bulbs in front of their house 24 hours. They don't even turn them off in the daytime. And it galls me. I want to knock on their door and say, don't you have a light detector turn off switch? It would just save some energy. Anyway, better than passing laws to promote 100% renewables by 2050, we should be promoting all low carbon resources, renewables, hydro, and nuclear. Here. So, and not only that, this is the checklist for high quality electric grid, reliable, clean, safe, low prices, low carbon sources, and so on. We have to also, this one, 0.6 is strong, and I put in this figure to back that up. Right now, we've been talking so much about electricity, but as transportation inevitably becomes more electrified, we're going to have more drains on it. So no matter how many efficient light bulbs we install, we're going to be more than offset by the use of electric vehicles and electricity and heating in industry and commercially. And so the grid is designed for a small percent of what Meredith calls prosumers. These are the people who generate their electricity at home. I was looking for this word, OPG, Ontario Power Generation. She did a brief look at Ontario, and it's having grown up there, I appreciate this. They have an hourly energy price of $1.83 per kilowatt hour. And
cents per kilowatt hour, not $1.83.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I appreciate that. Yes, less than 2 cents. Thank you. And 10 cents, almost 8 for the global adjustment. 10 times more, but still you need that to cover the cost of building new electricity infrastructure and maintaining resources. I used to run a water utility here in Applewood Hill. And we had the same sort of thing. You have to have extra money coming in besides that to maintain the equipment. And that was a nice way to support their systems. I think that's all. They have 18 reactors in Ontario. They're fueled with natural uranium. It's far cheaper than enriched uranium. Most people don't aware that they use CANDU reactors. This is a Canadian deuterated uranium plant. You could say they use deuterium, which is heavy water, heavy hydrogen combined with oxygen, making heavy water. And this is a more efficient moderator so that you don't need to enrich the uranium. They can use it straight out of the ground with less than 1/10% of the 235 isotope. So that since they can recycle this heavy water, it can last for a while, and it allows them to lower their costs as well, which I think is pretty cool. Now we saw this picture, those of you who saw 60 Minutes a week ago, were listening perhaps to Bill Gates, and I was quite excited when he came on and talked about natrium. Natrium stands for the chemical word for sodium, Na, and trium, I think, is for the fact that it's sodium moderated and cooled reactor for uranium, or in some cases thorium, but in this case they're using uranium. These are gigawatt hour scale energy storage capacitors at the back. And these are the nuclear plants here. They work at normal pressure, so you do not need to build these huge containment domes, much less concrete is needed. And what you do with the heat that's generated, it can go to a grid, but it can also, through a steam turbine, make electricity, but it can also go back and be stored in molten salt. So the reactors are not molten salt. The reactors are sodium cooled, but the storage is in molten salt. And it's shown in the next slide here. This is the underground natrium. It's a TerraPower reactor that Bill Gates has invested in, and it makes some electricity, but it also sends back some heat for keeping this salt warm. And there's a reserve tank in case there are any leaks or anything, but that heat can be maintained and then used during off periods as the wind or solar energy going into the system falls down at night. Then you can use some of this stored energy here. So instead of having a storage battery or pumped hydro, they use the idea of molten salt as a energy storage device. He's enthused about it because it lowers the cost below that of conventional nuclear technologies, and electricity can follow intermittent power provided by solar wind more effectively. So I thought that was an upbeat thing, and I hope that he's successful with that. Finally, the last slide, shorting the grid. This is, I'm asking now for questions, but just as we're fielding the questions, to remind you, I may have sent out this figure a few times before, but there are several countries here, about 4 countries, and several provinces of Canada. Some of them that use the blue, that's hydro over here, but nuclear is a large part of these successful regions and countries. So we can be thinking about that a little bit. We know how to do this. Let's get on with it. So happy to entertain questions. I have some extra slides in case the questions pertain to Texas. I can lift those up if we need them. So let me stop the share and we can get back into any questions on the chat. I'm not seeing any questions just yet. Do you see any, Meredith?
No, I don't see any. I don't see any questions, and I don't see any hand raises. Maybe you can unmute people, or I don't know. There's a lot of people.
Let me see here. We have 29 attendees.
Oh, there is a question. I see it. But it's not much of a question. It just says WH question mark. I don't, Lee Gasper Galvin.
Oh, okay. Allowed to talk. Do you want to comment, Lee? Here, let me unmute you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah. I guess I must have accidentally hit a wrong key or something. What I was trying to ask is, where can we buy the book, Shorting the Grid? How can we get a copy for ourselves?
Well,
I got mine from Amazon, but I'm sure it's available many places. Go ahead, Meredith.
you can get it from Amazon, and it's also available as a Kindle on Amazon. It's available through Ingram Spark, but you can't buy it directly from Ingram Spark. But Ingram Spark works with booksellers. And so if you have a local bookstore, you can go in and say, hey, I want to order this book. And they will probably almost certainly be able to do it as long as they know that it's at Ingram Spark.
Okay, thanks. And Richard, you were talking about the fact that the battery storage cannot make renewables base load quality, right? And just for some help that I need with my sustainability committee, I was wondering what percentage of the whole grid could be supported with batteries, do you think, judging from what Elon Musk did in Australia? Remember when they had a big power outage? I think it was because they had a huge storm, and Elon Musk went in there and put in lots and lots of batteries for storage for them. So using the data from that, do we have any idea what fraction of the grid we could say could be supported by renewables with batteries at their current technology capability?
Well, I'd have to look up the Elon Musk most recent thing in Australia, but when the big one he put in before this one would have backed up a major coal plant for about 2 hours. It wouldn't have backed up the whole grid. You have to look at how many megawatt hours he's planning to save, then what the megawatts on the grid in a battery, say having a battery, and then look at the number of megawatts on the grid and say, okay, he can do this many megawatt hours. There's that many megawatts on the grid. How many hours could he back up the grid? It's going to end up being less than an hour. I'm almost certain of that, because as I say, the one he did before that, the next biggest one, would have backed up a major a coal plant for about an hour. I think I have that in my book, but I don't want to spend my time right now trying to find that in the book. I have a chapter on will batteries save us, so maybe I'll try that.
Yeah, so less than 1 hour out of one 24-hour period, and then it will have basically shot what it could do. It couldn't do that the next day and the next day after that, correct?
No, it couldn't. And
Just
we have
a one-time shot.
We have another question here too from Dorothy Boatman. So I'm without being a pain in the butt, I'm going to try and move on to her question. Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah, no problem. Thank you for your help.
I have a hard time finishing up when there's some interesting stuff going on. Okay. Dorothy Boatman wrote, Wisconsin is still highly regulated. Is our grid more secure than the grid in Texas and California that are very deregulated? In my opinion, absolutely is. And one of the reasons is that you've got people who are responsible in Wisconsin, that if the grid was down for a really long time, then you would have a way to say, why is this happening, and so forth. And in the other places with the participants committee, not so easy to figure out what's going on. Accountability, that's it. It's not just about power plants, it's about accountability. Okay.
So could I add an adjunctive question there? Does that mean that our grid is more vertically integrated? Or
I believe it is.
the RTO is working better?
Well, I'm going to have to look. I honestly don't know if Wisconsin is an RTO area. I don't have them all memorized.
I think they're in the MISO, it's called, the Midwest ISO.
Well, if you're in the MISO area, then I'm sorry to say that yes, you are in MISO, and I'm sorry, I said the wrong thing to Dorothy. You're Boatman. You're in the MISO area, so your MISO runs a better than ERCOT does, and it runs better than California does. But it's still an ISO, and you're not gonna. You don't have very many ways to influence what goes on or keep people accountable for it. Okay. Now we have another question from Valerie Gardner and something in the chat too. So, oh my goodness.
That's good.
So,
We've got time. It's only 3 minutes after 11. We're okay.
Oh, okay. I'll read the Valerie Gardner question and then the chat question. Valerie Gardner writes, ratepayers over the decades have paid for the construction of most nuclear plants through increased rates. How is it that utilities and their regulators can accept decisions to close nuclear power plants and waste all that invested capital when they are still capable of generating power? This seems like a phenomenal waste. The answer is, I totally agree with you, but you understand that most of the money that's going around on a lot of it is going on a kilowatt hour auction where the plants only get paid for the next kilowatt hour. And then the issues become very, very complicated about some plants have outside funding for the next kilowatt hour, other plants don't. Some plants can undercut other plants for the next kilowatt hour. Groups have immense fights about how the capacity payments are going to be arranged and so forth. And so by the time you get through the thicket, you can say, well, there isn't a regulator deciding that the nuclear plants will be shut down. It's like the market. Well, the market, according to the rules set up by the people who want their plants to win the bids, a market set up by those rules, that's what's making the decisions. My book is on Amazon, and one of the people who wrote a review on Amazon was really, I was like, wow, I wish I thought of that. He said, the complexity and the difficulty to understand how the rules are made in the RTO system is a feature, not a bug. It's a feature for the people who are making the rules. And I thought, wow, why didn't I think about that? So anyhow, you can learn from people who read your book. It's really great. And then I tend to talk fast for trying to do this, but Gary Kanahak writes in the chat, given the problems with RTOs in your perfect world, what would be the electricity system design that we should strive to implement? I think we would strive to implement an electricity system which would be focused on reliability and clean power, and wouldn't be focused on the next 5 minutes, and wouldn't have complicated rules about how much money in a capacity market that a wind turbine can get. In a way you can say, how should a wind turbine even bid into a capacity market? But they do, but there are rules on how they have to do it. And it takes a real person who's an insider and has time on their hands to figure those rules out. So I would say that it would look a lot more like a vertically integrated utility, because when you get right down to it, a vertically integrated utility at least has accountability. And as I say, it's more about accountability, in my opinion, than pretty much anything else. Anybody? Anyway, how's that going for Gary? Is that good enough? Do you have comments?
Yeah, that's good. But I think that we also need to account for long-term planning. If we're trying to strive for a zero-emission electricity system, that needs to be included. And how do we make those decisions, those investment decisions for high capital cost projects that will also take us to that long-term goal? We definitely don't have that now in the RTOs, right?
That's right, we don't. I mean, it's impossible to build anything except a gas turbine, because the way the capacity markets go, or a renewable, because of the way the capacity markets go, there just isn't enough money to build anything that's more expensive. Capacity markets, academic studies show that capacity markets are good for plants that have low capital costs but high fuel costs, and very bad for plants that have high capital costs and low fuel costs. And we have another question here. Does my book address the public option of publicly owned utilities and grids? Not really. I mean, I really couldn't get into the ownership issues. There's so many issues I couldn't get into. I mean, when I began writing this book, somebody who's very knowledgeable about utilities told me it would be impossible to write it because the situation was too complicated. And so I couldn't cover publicly owned utilities and grids. But I will say that over in the Northwest, where there are a lot of them, they have very clean grids and very low prices. So, it's nice. But the book doesn't really address that issue per se.
If I could interrupt a moment there, we have to thank, I think, if I interpret your response correctly, we have to thank the Columbia River for the Northwest. I remember working, my first job after getting out of high school was studying the salmon runs on the Fraser River in British Columbia. And they kept saying, oh, well, the Americans, this was a binational company, agency, the Americans have ruined the Columbia River for their energy and the salmon aren't doing so well. Today, the Fraser River isn't doing any better than the Columbia River for salmon. But I think we have a lot to be grateful to the Columbia River for this hydro energy. I know we can't have it everywhere, but the people in the Northwest are lucky they have clean energy at a reasonable price. And I think it's pretty reliable.
One thing, our son used to live in the Northwest, and he's a real history buff. And when we were visiting him and we were showing us some of the dams, he said, "These dams beat Hitler." I said, "Huh?" And the reason is that they could make a lot of aluminum for airplanes during World War II.
To make one a day out there.
So I mean, there's different ways to look at the situation. So I also wanted to say that I didn't ask Valerie and Alan if my answers were okay. I did ask Dorothy and Gary, so I feel bad about that. I want to be.
You're in touch with them anyway, I imagine.
Oh,
are you not?
I'm in touch with Valerie. Yeah.
Gary is also closely linked with Valerie. They're on some groups together. Yeah, nuclear groups. It's lovely to see this attendance, and I am so grateful to you for coming. And I think I have to be, although COVID has been such a tragedy for the world, it's nice to appreciate some of the side benefits. And one of them is that Plato has benefited from having speakers like you come on, and all of us, I think in the future, our lives are permanently changed by having media like Zoom to keep in touch with one another more, because the visual, in addition to the auditory of the phone, really helps tremendously in the information exchange. And I'm really grateful to you, Meredith, for coming in, helping us to understand your book. One of my favorite phrases in your book is, "It's complicated, but you go ahead and deal with a complicated issue remarkably well." I really like your conversational style. It makes it easier to read.
Thank you. I try to make it approachable because there are books out there, mostly written for lawyers, which are case studies about these things, and nobody is going to actually really settle down to read them, even if you could afford to buy them. Lee Gasper Galvin has another question here in the Q&A, which is, how do you define vertically integrated utility? A vertically integrated utility owns everything, or at least leases everything, from the generating plant to your door. So, for example, it can be part owner of a big coal plant or a big nuclear plant, and then it'll have the power wheeled to its own substation. It'll be paying the transmission company for that wheeling. That's what they call it, wheeling, bringing the power across country. And then it will be at its own substation, and it'll show up at your door. And the people in that utility are responsible for you having your power. And so they if there's a line down, then they fix it. If a person's job disappears because of like COVID, you go to that utility and you say, I'm going to need 3 months to pay my bill, and so forth. So if vertically integrated, it's the whole thing. Now, in the RTO areas, you still have a certain amount of vertical integration because your local utility owns the line to your house and is the one that you go to if you say, you know, everybody in the family lost their job with COVID, we're going to need more time to pay, etc. But they don't have anything to do with the power plant. The power plant is there selling into the auction, unless your vertical utility is big enough to have made a power purchase agreement with power plant, but that doesn't always happen. And most of them buy from the auction.
Great answer. Thank you.
Well, there's more. Seven. Oh my gosh. Valerie Gardner. Oh, George Erickson has a comment. Before I go back to Valerie, let's see if George Erickson has a comment. Can you make the comment, George? I think talking is permitted. Hello, George.
I know him well. I don't see him. There he is. He says talking permitted. Yeah, according to this, he can, if he unmutes himself, he should be able to talk. It's permitted here. Do you want to unmute yourself, George?
Okay, let's go back to Valerie, and George, if you can unmute yourself, please do. I just feel like when we have an open question from someone else, it's
Sure.
Not right to wait. Valerie writes, I'm going to have a conversation with a member of the board of MISO. What question would you want me to ask him? Valerie, I believe that you've got some MISO definitely has nuclear plants.
Oh yeah.
And I would ask about how the nuclear plants can be protected from being undercut. Whether MISO can encourage ZECs, for example, in the different areas, zero emission credits. The big thing is to protect the nuclear plants and the baseload clean plants from being undercut by wind turbines that go on and off when they want to, and methane plants that are happy to get capacity payments and don't care how much they're running as much as a nuclear plant does.
Exactly.
Valerie, was that a help?
Yes, thank
okay.
you, Meredith. Good to hear you.
Nice cat.
Thanks.
Cat. Let me see, I think I'm going to hit answer live on some of these things because I don't know.
You're doing fine.
They're all open questions, but I've answered some of them. George, can you type your comment? George Erickson? Well, in the meantime, Gary has a question.
Yes.
Are publicly owned and operated electric utilities a realistic possibility? It seems that the profit motive has seriously impaired the ability to serve the common good. Well, there's a lovely debate. I'm not gonna go to that one because I think that there are excellent publicly owned and operated electric utilities all over the Northwest that are not investor-owned utilities, and there are excellent investor-owned utilities in the South. So I'm just going to say, depends on the utility. And anyway, I'd like other people to answer that because that isn't my expertise area for sure.
Can we try again? This is George.
Great.
I had a bad connection, sorry. By the way, my name is not spelled with the extra E in there.
Right, we see that.
Okay. Thank you, first of all, for the presentation, both of you. Very useful. I did want to make a couple comments. Regarding batteries, first of all, Meredith, by the way, your comments on the Vermont plant are in unintended consequences, as is references to your book about shorting the grid.
Oh, wow.
And I want to make a comment about batteries because I constantly update unintended consequences. I have new links through some very good articles about batteries, and they are not complementary. I think it's chapter 10 at the end of solar. But at any rate, what I'd like to do is send the newest update to Richard, and he can forward it to the group. And if they just do a search for batteries, they'll have them. The other comment is regarding in the environment. I realize that wasn't the focus here today, but I don't think we want to lose sight of the really disastrous environmental consequences of wind and solar, from shovel in the ground all the way to the end of their lives. And that's about it. Thank you for the good work from both of you.
George, that's great. I didn't even realize I saw that title, the name with the E in it. And I said, oh, I don't know this person. And I thought, oh no, I know. You wrote the book. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. It's great to hear from you.
Thanks.
And, I wanted to say something else about batteries, which is maybe not. One of the things in my book is I feel that there's a lot of sort of half-truths running around in the RTO areas. And so, for example, in our area, there's a lot of discussion about beat the peak. That is, if there's a peak amount of electricity being used at on a summer day, then everybody should, back off and not use their air conditioner so much and so forth and so on. Now, I believe in conservation, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to do. I mean, I just feel that it's often phrased in terms of saving the environment when it's actually the reason your utility is so excited about it is it's saving money for your utility. And the way it's saving money is not what you might think. In an RTO area, the cost of the transmission system is assessed on several principles, but one of the biggest principles is how much does that utility, each utility, use on the hottest day? What is their demand on the transmission system, which means how many kilowatt hours are happening for one from that utility for 1 hour on the hottest day when the demand is at the peak. So if the utility can drop its use at that point, it will be assessed less money from running the transmission system. And that's where it's saving its money. So, for example, here we have Green Mountain Power, which is a big utility, and it has really good people estimating when the peak is going to be, and it's bought a lot of batteries, and it pulls its batteries up together. It pulls its batteries together and to run them at the peak times, and then it announces that it has now saved its customers, $500,000. Well, it wasn't $500,000 worth of electric power. It was $500,000 of money that they would have to pay the transmission company that some other utility is now going to have to pay. And meanwhile, Vermont Electric Cooperative, a little company, is also trying to beat the peak, but it doesn't have the resources. So it organizes people to promise to cut back and help them beat the peak and so forth. But if they don't, sometimes they just miss it and they end up paying more. Anyway, I just feel like there's a lot of kind of misleading stuff that goes on that takes advantage of our desire to be green, to be good human beings, good citizens, not strain the system, when it really isn't about straining the system. It's about, can we transfer this cost of transmission to another utility? That would be good.
Good point. Thank you for making that. That needed to be made.
And,
Any other questions there?
Oh, Mert Corwin asks, how do the utilities justify the mega dollars charged to the Texas customers in these storm events? It's pretty simple. If they're paying $9 per kilowatt hour on the grid, on the auction, where else are they going to get the money to pay themselves back? The only source is the customers, so they don't even feel they have to justify it. I mean, the auction. I mean, one of the things I've read was somebody in Texas saying, no, this is working just the way it should. And the price on the auction went up to $9,000, and then they began cutting back and doing rolling blackouts. Well, the rolling blackouts weren't rolling blackouts. They were much worse. They almost lost the grid. But in the meantime, it's worth noting that they don't perceive it as something they have to justify. If the price is going up, then they're getting that price unless they have to. They can't even do it. Keep things going, getting that price, and they have to cut back and do rolling blackouts. There's no need to justify anything from their point of view. Was that a helpful answer, Mert? Was that good enough? I mean, I just want to make sure that we're almost out of time, I think.
I would say it's a profitability answer in contrast to the predatory approach that the customers feel.
Well, I mean, if I was a customer there, I'd feel that they were being fairly predatory. I mean, here's this huge event and they can't get power and water systems are being compromised and sewer systems are being compromised and all kinds of very important infrastructure is being compromised. And at the end of it, I get to pay $9,000. I get to pay hundreds and hundreds of dollars in my utility bill. What good did they do me? You know, I would be mad too.
I have a minor question to ask, Richard here. They're having significant water problems now. My question is this 90% or 100% due to water mains that broke due to the cold weather and a subsequent thaw, or was a lot of it due to lack of electricity for pumping when it was needed in various general breaks?
I think that the people are going to spend weeks answering questions like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in the meantime, at one point, even my book is really about systematic mismanagement of the grid. It's not a book very much about how a big event could cause a big blackout and everyone would suffer. I mean, there are really good books like Lights Out by Ted Koppel about that. But at any rate, I was invited to speak about what I know about a meeting of a group called InfraGard. And InfraGard is a group that's partially run by Homeland Security, and it's about resiliency of American infrastructure. So, okay, I was a very interesting group. I went to speak to it. And they brought out a book recently in which they evaluated the different effects of different problems with infrastructure. For every piece of infrastructure, the first question they ask is, how will this be affected if the grid goes down? So if you look at a hospital, if you look at a police station, if you look at a sewage treatment plant, if you look at food distribution, the first question for each of them, they've organized the book. So the first question for every one of them was, what will happen to this if the grid is down? And I think we all have to think that these people are really trying to figure out what to do about what. And that's their first question.
And of course, there's a huge problem with icing conditions. You may recall the time quite a few years ago when Montreal and Quebec around it had a bad ice storm. And I think in that case, the grid went down and it took them a long time to get the grid back in Montreal. You remember that?
Yeah, I wasn't here then, but I've read about it and I've seen the pictures of the transmission towers bent over, and also I've heard that what I have seen in person, if you drive to Montreal, which is surrounded by a ring of transmission lines and stuff, and apparently this is part of its insurance against this ever happening quite the same way again. And so anyway, yeah, absolutely the case.
Well, we certainly, I don't think these storms are going to be once in a generation. And I think that more and more people are catching on that we do need to lower our emissions to reduce the frequency of these very violent storms. And even the polar vortex has been said, and we need more climatology research, I suppose, to document it thoroughly, but it seems that the polar vortex its frequency is going up as a result of instability in the Arctic.
Yeah, I have another question here from Lee Gasper Galvin.
Yes.
Instead of law saying 100% renewables by 2050, what percent renewables would be a more reasonable goal? I don't like to call it a renewable goal. I would like to see a clean energy goal of a lot of clean energy on the grid, more energy available on the grid than we have now, in order to make it more possible to use heat pumps and electric vehicles and so forth. And 80% clean energy on the grid, which would be a mixture of nuclear, renewables, and hydro. I think that would be reasonable. And frankly, the renewables part would probably be only about 20%, and the nuclear hydro part would be 60%.
What about 100% clean? Is that not doable?
It could be doable, but I'm a little negative about, okay, here we go. Everybody have a few minutes here. If you really want to back up renewables at all, then you have two choices. You have at this point you have hydro and you have natural gas, and natural gas is what people use. Now, I have a little hydro plant that I can see from my window on the Connecticut River. And that plant has been used as a peaker plant for years. That is, it only has about 30% capacity factor. It has to wait for the pond behind it to fill. And then it's used when there's peak demand on the grid. They have pretty much gone, local people have gone and talked to FERC about it a lot. And apparently it is going to be changed from a peak to run of the river, because sending the water through in peak times has caused erosion downstream. So I guess the thing is that until we have more flexible nuclear plants, and I hope that day comes very, very soon, we're going to have renewable plants that can't be backed up by hydro. And so I would they're being backed up by methane. And I think it's unreasonable to say by 2050, that's all going to change. Maybe it will, but we're going to need a new generation of nuclear plants to do backup for some of these intermittent renewables. I can just look out my window and see, I don't think it's all going to be hydro backing them up anymore.
Yeah. Thank you for that. You show some realism that we all need a dose of, but we need to work as hard as we can to get there, because the predictions of Mark Linus and others of temperature rise are ominous unless we make every effort we can to get there.
I just want to say one thing about it, that I think that this business of 100% or nothing can be very discouraging to people. And I would rather have people look at it about the progress we're making, understanding that we need to make a lot of progress, not saying, oh, well, you know, I unplugged my phone overnight nowadays, you know, like, oh, yeah, great, that's going to do it, you know, but yeah, that we need to make a progress pretty quickly, but not to get to the point where we're thinking, well, if we don't get to 100% by 2050, we're gone. I think it'd be better to say we've got to at least get to 80% by 2050 if we possibly can. You know, something that is doable.
Right. Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes. Hi, Dorothy.
Yes. Going to Texas, I think we're all concerned, since Texas has opted kind of out of the national system. What can be done to make them, you know, create a more robust system for Texans? Can anything be done, or is it all up to Texas to decide what to do?
Okay, I would like to say one thing about their opting out. Their neighboring grids were in trouble when they were in trouble. If they had been connected to the neighboring grids, which many people say is very important, it wouldn't have helped them. I mean, it might have helped them 3 days into it when the neighboring grids were getting on their feet again, but it wouldn't have helped at the time. So I feel that that's a bit of a kind of blaming Texas for being, you know, the cowboy Lone Star state, and it wouldn't have actually helped their grid. Meanwhile, FERC has some responsibility for reliability, even if it's all within a state. And FERC could actually insist that Texas arrange to be more reliable. But mostly it is going to be Texas. We can try to influence FERC to make rules about reliability, that, for example, that pipelines have heated valves or something. I mean, that's just something I've thought of. I'm not saying that's the highest priority. FERC could make some rules like that, even if it's all within Texas.
So they could be required to harden their system and to make it more weather resistant.
Yes, I believe they could be required to do that by FERC, because FERC is about reliability. They have a lot more power over a state, over something if it goes between states. I mean, there's no question that Texas cutting away from the other states got it free of some of FERC oversight, but I don't believe it got rid of all of her. It got free of all of FERC oversight. Of course, I'm not a lawyer, but my impression is that FERC definitely continues to have some reliability power.
May I make some comments too about the Texas situation? In the Epoch Times, it said that Texas had not winterized their natural gas lines. They froze. They didn't winterize their wind turbines. They froze. And they say that northern states, like, for example, you know, Wisconsin, we have all those same sources, right? But we winterize ours. And so we're ready for that kind of weather. And they were not in their case. So So that's really, and Texas knows that they have this kind of a winter event once every 8 to 10 years, but they've chosen, because they wanted to save money, they didn't want to winterize their system. So that's really where the problem lies.
That's one of the major problems, that they didn't winterize their system. And you're absolutely right. Wind turbines and gas pipelines go through Wisconsin, they go through Vermont, and we take the steps about de-icing and winterizing. But as I say, I think that after this level of disaster, I think FERC might be able to exert some power over how much they winterize. You know, it's okay if you say, oh, well, every 10 years we're going to lose power for part of a day. This wasn't losing power for part of a day. This was a disaster.
Good point. Any other questions out there? Well, I think we've had a good discussion. And again, I really appreciate your willingness to come and help us with this book. I would have, it's a wonderful book, but to have you as author come and help us through it, and particularly in the question period, is a delight and for us, and we appreciate it very much. So thank you again. We will stay in touch, and we invite you to come and join us sometimes in the future if you feel so inclined. When we have, I think we're going to have some other speakers that relate to this subject a little bit. Neil in Canada and Robert at Dartmouth and so on. So we'd be happy to have you participate in those if you're available.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me here.
It was a real pleasure. Okay. Goodbye, everyone. I hope to see you all next Monday, or as many of you would like to listen to a review of a book called Future C. It's going to be quite broad, and we'll cover more than just the book. But we do need to think about the other 70% of the Earth's covering and respect it, particularly in regard to its acidification, as we've talked about before. But this is an interesting book and leads us into some good discussions. So have a good week in the meantime. And thanks again to all for joining in this very interesting hour and a half. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of help.
Good. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.